look, from Liberation Day to Independence Day, our members have really been asking the same questions. Can we keep tariffs down and can we get more clarity? And as they're looking at the Vietnam deal, which, let's just be very clear, is just simply a post on Truth Social at this point in terms of what people know, we're really asking the same questions. Can we keep tariffs down? If we get more clarity, can we actually learn the details of what is in this deal?
Right. So if it is 20% on Vietnamese imports as opposed to 46% that was announced in early April, can that be managed by your members, by US manufacturers that have supply chains in Vietnam, or is that going to be problematic? Is the bigger issue, therefore, going to be this 40% transshipment duty?
Well, and this gets really to the heart of the questions. I mean, how does that 20% get calculated? Does it get calculated on every single good the same way? Is it 20% on top of the very, very high MFN rates that we already pay? Or is it a 20% that operates as a simple baseline where if you're already at 20%, you don't go higher? So these are some of the questions that we've been asking the administration. They're taking note. They're on listen mode in terms of what those questions are, but they've not been able to share any of the details yet. And then, how do you look at that transshipment? I think your last guess really hit the nail on the head. What is the definition of transshipment at its literal sense? Transshipment is something that's actually illegal in the United States right now. So, you could read that Truth Social post to indicate that something that's currently prohibited is now going to be allowed, but have to pay a 40% tax. I don't think that's what the president means. I think he's talking about something connected to maybe where the inputs come from, or is it, made in partnership with China? We don't know yet, and it's a little hard to kind of speculate about what's that going to look like. You did raise a very good question: is how are you going to enforce all that? Whatever the terms are, 20%, 40%. What are the rules of origin? What are other elements of these deals going to look like? It will really come down to enforcement too, because our members, they invest millions of dollars in making sure that they're complying with goods, and you want to make sure that the bad actors aren't taking advantage of those rules.
Stephen, so on balance, there are more questions than answers, and more clarification is required from the administration in terms of how you define transshipment. But does Vietnam provide the playbook for negotiated deals with the rest of Southeast Asia, where I'm sure many of your membership have supply chains and a lot at stake?
Yeah, quite possibly. And of course, maybe the playbook is actually being provided by the details that we've seen from the UK agreement already. I think it is probably going to look very similar. Over the next couple of days, we're going to see a lot of things get announced, I imagine. We're going to see some deals, possibly there'll be some delays, and definitely we're going to see duties. And we're really hoping that we're going to see details come out of this. It's going to be really important to understand how all these provisions work, because at the end of the day, these are all major supplier countries. Vietnam is the source of the number 2 supplier for apparel, for footwear, and for travel goods to the U.S. And if we are seeing an extra duty, let's say 20% on top of all of those goods coming in from Vietnam, that's going to have an impact as those goods get to the United States. If we start to see that across the board for other major supplier countries in Southeast Asia, other parts of the world too, that will just magnify the cost pressures that will be on all of these supply chains, which will then show up as higher prices for Americans. One thing to really keep in mind, about 97% of all the apparel, footwear, travel goods that we consume in the United States are made in another country. Right now, all of those goods are facing between a 10 to 30% extra tariff as we hit, back to school and holiday season. If the result of all these new deals is that 10 to 30% actually gets increased for the future, make no mistake, this is going to be inflationary. We're all going to begin to see those costs roll through in the form perhaps of price increases or other things that will ultimately affect, the U.S. consumer and the U.S. economy.
Stephen, so what is your membership doing? Are they building as much inventory as they can, given the risks that lie ahead? Are they continuing to seek alternative supply chains and diversify geographically, and continuing to engage in the administration? Is that all they can do given this heightened uncertainty still?
They're doing all of that and more. I mean, it's hard to diversify your supply chains when you don't know where the higher tariff sourcing countries are going to be. You can guess, and if you guess wrong, that's going to be a decision that you may have to live with for a long time. So a lot of those decisions are being put on hold. Companies are looking at, how they can develop stronger partnerships with their supply chain partners right now, because we don't know whether they're going to need to work with them to move to a different supplier country going forward. They've been spending a lot of time talking to the administration, trying to explain how their supply chains work, and then to ask those questions.
Yes.
The list goes on with all the different things that they're looking at doing. What's really critical, though, is in our industry, trade is so important. I mean, as I mentioned before, 97% of all the goods that we consume are made in another country, but we still have 3.6 million American jobs. So there's really good jobs in the United States that are connected to the supply chains that thread really throughout the world. At the same time, 96% of all the people on the planet who wear clothes and shoes live outside the United States. So if you want to be successful in our industry, you need access to global consumers and global suppliers, which is why trade is so important, which is why the details of these trade agreements is absolutely vital. You need to know the details really, really well in order to be able to make smart decisions and to be able to get these things right.
Stephen, is there a risk that American manufacturers, and have you heard any of these rumblings amongst your membership, that they could uproot from Vietnam and even reshore back and return to China if it's price competitive, and if the rules of the game do end up being on the draconian side?
Well, and this is one of the questions that we kind of keep asking is, what is the point of this tariff policy? What are you trying to do? And, if you are turning around and putting a tariff of between 20 to 40% on top of the existing tariffs that we already, again, existing very, very high tariffs averaging 12.5%, 15.5%. Those are just the averages. If you put that 20 to 40% tariff on top of that existing high tariff, are you in effect discouraging that Vietnamese sourcing and then trying to perhaps push that back to China, which doesn't seem to be consistent with kind of where the political winds are blowing in Washington. So we're not getting a really clear message about tariff policy. We were hearing early on this was about making more product in the United States, something that's not really in the cards for our industry. And then, of course, the president just a few weeks ago said the purpose of these tariffs is not to make more sneakers and socks and T-shirts in the United States. We agree tariff policy isn't going to bring about more manufacturing. But what is the point of these tariffs if it's to do something other than ultimately increase prices for American consumers?
Stephen, that said, without a doubt, the writing's been on the wall for quite some time. So I'd be very surprised if your membership and names like Nike have not been diversifying. Just how well diversified are they out of Vietnam? I've seen a figure of 45%. That's the number that Nike still sources. It still sources 45% of its footwear from Vietnam. Still seems on the high side. Is that enough, though, to mitigate any immediate cost pressures that may arise out of the tariff landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been a long-term diversification outside of China, which is still the #1 supplier for apparel, footwear, and travel goods into the U.S. A lot of that diversification went right to Vietnam, which helped them grow to the #2 slot. But diversification has been going to a number of countries. Some of the countries in Southeast Asia had been more prominent in the past, and they're becoming more prominent again. A lot of companies are looking at Western Hemisphere, and there are companies that are looking at made in USA still. So that, again, I'm not trying to take that off the table. It's just not something that's going to be the cure-all to tariffs, as something you might kind of think based on the comment that if you want to avoid the tariffs, just manufacture the goods in the United States. So diversification is definitely an important part of this, and companies have been doing diversification strategies for many years. The question is you can't look at what's happening right now and get any guidance on what that diversification strategy is going to be. Should you be putting your trade in free trade agreement countries, the CAFTA DR, the USMCA countries, for example? There are some trade policy signals that suggest yes and some that suggest no, and different companies are going to react to these signals differently. So
Yes.
in the absence of sort of a clear signal, I think companies are basically waiting to see how they're going to move or make their next moves on some of these sourcing. They definitely have been doing some of that in the past, but what do you do in the next couple of months? That's hard to say.